There is a reaper whose name is Death, and with his sickle keen he reaps the bearded grain out of breath and the flowers that grow between. He gazed at the flowers with tearful eyes, he kissed their dropping leaves. It was for the Lord of Paradise he bound them in his sheaves. My Lord has need of these flowers, the reaper said and smiled. Dear tokens of the earth they are, where he was once a child. They shall all bloom in fields of light, transplanted by his care. Saints upon their garments white the sacred blooms wear. And the mothers gave, with tears and pain, the flowers she most did love. She knew she should find them all again in the fields of light above. Oh, not in cruelty, not in wrath, the reaper came that day, was an angel that visited the green earth and took those flowers away. A poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow.
I'm Darlene.
And I'm Melody.
This is
Hard Times and True Crimes.
We have a different setup tonight.
We are at my house, and it's evening. We weren't sure if we were going to be able to drink coffee tonight.
Yes.
But since we're actually recording the day before the Independence Day.
Right.
So since we don't have to work tomorrow.
Espresso it is.
Espresso it is. We'll be up all night.
Yes.
This coffee is from a company called 7 Weeks. Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard of them?
No, I haven't.
I heard about them on another podcast. I believe it was Allie Beth Stuckey's. I looked them up and I was so impressed with their mission because what they do is they support pregnancy care centers all over the United States. They have a network of over 850 pro-life organizations. They donate 10% of every sale to pro-life pregnancy care centers. And I know you and I discovered that we both have, at different times in our lives, volunteered for our local pregnancy care center.
Yes.
And so that was one more thing that we had in common. So when I heard about them, I thought, oh, Darlene's going to love that.
I do. I love it.
So I reached out to them, and they sent us 2 bags of coffee to try, and to support our episodes. So the one I did for tonight was the espresso blend.
And it's good.
Yeah, it is good. It's strong.
I was going to say, it has some oomph in it.
Yeah. And I made that in my French press so we could have like a cold brew, but I'm enjoying mine a lot.
Me too.
Yeah, it's strong, but it's very smooth.
It is.
And so this is what's really cool. The name 7 Weeks Coffee. At 7 weeks, a baby is the size of a coffee bean. At 7 weeks of pregnancy.
That is precious.
And that is when the heartbeat is first detectable. Hence the name 7 Weeks Coffee. So, listeners, if you want to support pro-life causes, go to 7weekscoffee.com and place an order. To, like I said, 10% will go to pro-life pregnancy care centers. And, you know, it's for a good cause.
Right. And you'll get yourself some good coffee.
Yes, it's very good. And so thank you to 7 Weeks Coffee for sponsoring this episode.
Yes.
Their little slogan is drink coffee, save lives.
That is precious. I love it.
It is. And just so you know, they do source their coffee through direct trade. So it's very ethically sourced and everything.
That is awesome. Great mission.
It is.
The story I'm going to tell today is a little bit different. It's out of Pennsylvania.
The one I'm doing next is also.
Really?
I hope it's not the same story.
I do too. Is yours a little different too?
I think so.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, we shall see.
Yeah.
Susanna Sloniker was born in Bedford County, there in Pennsylvania, on November 6th in 1827. Her parents were German, like most everyone else in those parts at the time. When she was 20 years old in the spring of 1847, a good-looking guy named Samuel Cox, he moved to the region from Indiana, which was a long way, 8-9 hours.
Across those mountains.
Yeah. So, yeah, he came there. And after a very quick courtship, because I think he came there in like April or May, and they were married on December 30th of that same year. Yeah.
That was quick.
So Susanna Sloniker became Susanna Cox. On March 28th in 1849, she gave birth to their first child, a son they named George. And then on October 29th, 1850, little Joseph came into the world. And then Samuel took his family and moved back to Indiana. And that was in 1851. And he was really excited to bring his little family back to see his friends and family. But after they settled in, malaria fever swept through. I mean, I guess it was pretty prevalent there in Indiana at the time, and all four of them ended up contracting it.
Oh.
But George and Joseph, it nearly killed them.
Yeah.
So for months, they kind of lingered at death's door. They didn't know for sure if they were going to live or not. And Susanna told Samuel, she was really afraid that if they stayed there, her boys were not going to live. In the Alleghenies Mountains, diseases like malaria were unheard of. Well, you think about it, the cabins are so far apart.
Okay. And I guess they're not going to be spreading it to
Right.
close neighbors. When they were in Indiana, were they in more of a city?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it makes sense.
She begged her husband to, let's go and take the boys back to the mountains. And he trusted her judgment and traveled back to her home state, back in the lonely woods of Bedford County, Pennsylvania, where she'd grown up. And Susanna was right. Life out there, it wasn't for everybody, but the Cox family thrived. The boys loved running around out there, hunting with their daddy, and that fresh mountain air did do wonders for their health. They were growing stronger every day. When I first heard this story, I heard it in song form.
Really?
Years and years ago. Well, my boys were about the same age as these boys. And I don't know, it just pulled at my heartstrings because it reminded me so much of my boys.
Is this going to make me cry?
I don't know, maybe. So George, he had dark hair and blue eyes. Joseph had blonde hair and gray eyes, just a little over a year apart. They were both a little shorter for their age, and that was most likely because of the illness that they had contracted. They were just a little bit smaller. George always looked after his little brother. He'd hold him by his hand and lead him wherever they went, and they were almost always together. Samuel built a cabin out there, and they were just as happy as could be. And then to add to their happiness, in 1852, Susanna gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah May. And then 2 years later, in 1854, they welcomed Anna Josephine. I love that name.
Oh, I like that too.
The family were well thought of. They were known as good Christians and just had a real good reputation out there, even though Samuel wasn't from there. And normally they were kind of suspicious of outsiders, but he just must have made a good impression. In 1856, Susanna was pregnant with her fifth child, and she had just been so blessed not to have lost any babies, because most did. I mean,
back then,
yeah.
It was not an uncommon thing for sure.
No, and all of her children at that point were thriving, and her heart was just full. But on Thursday morning of April 24th in 1856, it was an unusually cold and foggy morning there in the mountains. I'd imagine bringing those mountains were probably cold anyway.
Sure.
But the family had sat down to eat their breakfast when Samuel heard his dog barking, and he thought his hound had most likely treed up a squirrel for him.
Oh, yeah.
He was too hungry, though, not to finish his breakfast, but he told his wife, if this dog is still barking when I finish, I'm going to go out there and see what he's got. He scarfed down the rest of his food, and he was starting to head out the door when George, he was like, can I go? And normally his dad did let him go, but they were still eating. And this was only about an eighth of a mile from the cabin that he was going. So he was like, just finish your breakfast. I'm going to run out there and I'll be right back. So when the boys, Susanna and the little girls, finished eating, George and Joseph went out to play while Susanna was occupied with the little girls in her morning chores. Meanwhile, Samuel found his dog. He shot the big squirrel that he'd had treed up. He gutted the squirrel real quick to keep it from spoiling and then started back towards the cabin. But he took a different route than the one he'd taken to get there, which was really unusual, but he just, made a split decision and took a different route. When he got back to the cabin, Susanna asked where the boys were. She'd assumed their daddy had decided to take them because when she last saw them, they were holding hands with their backs turned to her. They were walking out that little clearing out of their yard. So Susanna and Samuel realized the boys had probably attempted to follow their daddy.
Right. Oh, I hate this. Just this week, my neighbor came in my driveway. I could tell by looking out the window that she was distraught. And she was like, we can't find our 3-year-old anywhere.
Oh, my gosh.
And you know that feeling you get? Because we've all,
yes.
for a moment, lost sight of our kids. My heart just dropped. And I'm like, kids, get your shoes on. We're going to help look. And the little girl had climbed into her grandma's car and went home with her grandma before anybody realized it. And so that had a happy ending. But just that feeling, that first split second when you're like, our kid is missing, is so terrifying.
It is absolutely terrifying. Ugh. Of course, they started searching in a frenzy, looking everywhere they thought possible for them to wander in just such a short time. It hadn't been that long. But there was no sign of them. So they hurried back home, praying that the boys would be there waiting for him. But of course, we know that was not the case. Samuel rode his horse to the nearest neighbor and asked for help. And of course, news it spread like wildfire. News spread. And neighbors looked out for neighbor up there. It was just one of those communities. Everyone knew this was a life or death situation. Those two little beautiful boys alone in these rugged mountains.
And how old were they again?
They were 7 and 5.
Oh.
Storekeepers closed up their shops. Farmers put down their plows. Men on horses, on foot, from farm to farm, cabin to cabin, combing the mountains, looking for those little lost boys. The first night, there were 200 searchers.
Oh, wow.
That's incredible.
That is. These are the mountains.
Yes. In the 1800s.
Right.
The temperatures had dipped low. The boys were not dressed for that kind of weather. By the next morning, every ravine had been searched. The hilltops, they could not find a trace of these babies.
Oh, I hate this.
Susanna and Samuel were brokenhearted and, of course, exhausted with grief. Their neighbors did their best to comfort them, but, they came and they had food. They actually even spent the night with them. But how do you comfort somebody in a situation like that?
Exactly.
The thing that they did that was a comfort to them was that they continued searching. Even through the second night, they had their torches. They just did everything that they could. News of these missing boys had, at this point, spread all over the state of Pennsylvania. And searchers were coming onto the mountain every day. At one time, there was like 3,000 people.
Wow, that's pretty incredible.
It really was. It was a very real concern that the boys had fallen into a creek, into a stream, and drowned. And with every nightfall, it grew less likely that they were going to be found alive. If nothing else, what were they going to eat?
We'll be back after a quick break.
At the beginning of this year, one of my New Year's resolutions was to get my home decluttered and organized, especially my kitchen. Just going in there felt daunting. Even family meals were no longer enjoyable. I knew that I needed help because the thought of tackling it on my own was overwhelming. And then Melody told me about Shannon over at Functional Spaces. And let me tell you that meeting her transformed my kitchen from a cluttered mess to a cozy functional space that I once again can take pleasure in.
Everyone has that one chaotic area in their home that requires excessive time and energy to manage. Many of us can identify more than one. For Darlene, that was just inside her kitchen door.
Yes, everybody would come in and throw mail, keys, and coats all over the counters and chairs. I told Shannon this was such a source of stress for me. Why couldn't everybody just put their stuff away? And she explained that we could easily turn that area into a place of peace and productivity, a true functional space. We added a coat rack with key hooks and a small mail bin, and that has been a game changer. That's just one example of the difference she made.
Functional Spaces is based in the Triangle and serves Central North Carolina. If you're ready to experience that same transformation, go to functionalspacesnc.com and fill out the contact form. You will receive a link to schedule your discovery call to chat about your project area. Again, that's functionalspacesnc.com. Tell her your friends at Hard Times and True Crime sent you. Right, and I mean, those parents were just losing hope.
Yeah. So I'm going to read a newspaper article from the Bedford Inquirer from Friday, May 2nd, in 1856 that said, "Lost children. Yesterday, Thursday week, 2 small boys, the children of a Mr. Cox, a very worthy man, one 7 years old and the other 5. They lived at the foot of the Allegheny Mountains in Union Township. The boys strayed away from their home and have not been discovered. They left in the morning, and their absence was not noticed for a couple of hours. The father started after them, but could not see nor hear anything from them. This is a very wild section of the country, and in places is almost impossible, from thickets of trees and bushes. Nearly every day since, there have been from 500 to 1,000 persons, man, woman, and children, from that portion of Bedford and Cambria counties on the hunt, surveying along and hunting in circles. They've examined the country for many miles. On last Monday, about 10 miles from the parents in the wilderness, children's tracks were discovered. The children may yet be alive, and there are great many chestnuts this year on the mountain. The most cause of fear is from wild beasts, as there are wolves and wildcats in this region, and at this time of year are said to be quite ferocious. The people are quite excited and determined not to give up the hunt until they are found, dead or alive. Some of the citizens of this place are talking of joining in the hunt, and we hope a large part may start out, as the people there are almost exhausted. This is truly a heart-rending occurrence." This is a letter from a Mr. William Griffith, who was from their town, a kind and just a benevolent man. He ended up even putting in a bounty, not a bounty, but he put up a reward.
Oh, yeah.
And this is what he wrote to the newspaper editors and just asked them to please put this out. "Please urge upon all who can to join in the search for the lost children at the head of George's Creek. It is now pretty certain they are on the mountain beyond King's Cabin, and unless greater numbers engage, it may take all week to find them. I trust it is not to be supposed that there is so little humanity in the people of our country as to suffer those poor little boys to linger out, to starve. Business is entirely suspended, and the community is engaged in the search. The assistance of our friends at a distance is earnestly solicited to continue the search." Now imagine the heartbreak that Samuel and Susanna are experiencing. And it got even worse because a man in the community spread the accusation that they, the parents, had murdered their little boys.
Oh, my goodness.
In order to gain sympathy and then also money from compassionate neighbors. And worst of all, there were people who jumped on that bandwagon.
Well, there always will be. I mean, and when, that does happen, and sometimes that's the truth. But what made him throw that accusation out there?
They couldn't understand. There was no trace of them, and just suspicion. And honestly, we know that usually it is somebody close to home.
And I don't know why, but to me, it seems like back then it's not as likely.
Right.
I don't know why. There's no rhyme or reason to that. It just feels like that to me.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But because of these rumors, a lot of the searchers stopped coming out.
Oh, no.
And they lost manpower.
Sure.
Accusations like that, they can be dangerous. It got so ugly that a group of men barged into their home, tore up their cabin floor where they kept their root vegetables to winter, wanting to find the boys' bodies. They also tore up their garden. And of course, they didn't find anything, just tearing their place up. And if I had lost a child, to have that suspicion on me would be
like, what a horrible thing to go through.
Heartbreaking. Yes. A man who was in on the search when he was just 19 years old wrote an article about it in 1909. He remembered the accuser of the parents. He said the man and his accomplices ended up being forced to leave Spruce Hollow to avoid a coat of tar and feather, if not a lynching.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
So now emotions all over the board are running really, really high. Yeah.
So just after this, about 10 miles from the Cox home, 2 sets of little tracks were found.
Oh.
That were definitely from George and Joseph.
Oh. 10 miles.
10 miles. They just couldn't understand because the tracks led to a swollen creek.
Ugh.
They knew there was no way that the boys could have crossed that creek. They were thinking the boys probably drowned.
Yeah.
But a woman, she heard a child crying in the night. And now we know that that most likely was one of those little boys. So the minds of some of the searchers turned to witchcraft, which was believed back then as was like, you try that if you've tried everything else.
Yeah.
But the Cox parents, they weren't really okay with it. And the townspeople there, they saw nothing wrong with it. But Samuel and Susanna, they were very devout Christians, and they just really didn't want to involve any magic or any form of witchcraft. And their neighbors did respect their wishes for a while, but eventually somebody or some people went on to an older black man who lived in Morrison Cove, not too far away, who had a reputation of being a magician. He could do things like locate water with a peach twig, just lots of Appalachia folk magic. Yeah. He was sure that he could lead the searchers to the kids, but he actually wasn't able, of course. So then they went to this old witch in Somerset County who could supposedly see the future. And she claimed that she could see the lost boys, but none of what she told them ever turned out anything.
And we still see that to happen
all
today,
the time.
all the time, too.
All the time,
yeah.
yep. The Bedford Inquirer read, $100 reward. We are authorized by reliable gentlemen in this county to offer a reward of $100 for the discovery of the two little sons of Mr. Samuel Cox of Union Township, Bedford County. This reward will be paid for the recovery of the children, dead or alive. We hope this reward will stimulate some of the old hunters in that desolate and most unpenetrable region to use every effort in their power to restore these babes in the woods to their afflicted parents. About 10 miles away from the Cox cabin, a man named Jacob Dibert. He wasn't from that section. He was kind of like Samuel. He had married a girl from there. Him and his wife had heard, everybody had heard about it. You know, you see it's in the newspaper. So everybody had heard about the missing boys. Everybody was talking about it. It was on everybody's mind. And he told his wife, I really wish somebody would find those boys. And they just talked about it this one night. He went to bed that night. This was the 8th day that they were out there.
Okay.
And he had a dream that he was out on the mountain alone looking for the boys. And he came to a dead deer. And then a little further on, he came to this little worn out shoe. And then to this large stream, which at its narrowest point, there was this fallen tree that had made a natural bridge. And so in this dream, he crossed that bridge and he came into this little ravine. And there was this small, like a brook. He followed that brook down, went down the stream and came to this large birch tree with roots spread out in like a semicircle. And in the midst of that semicircle, lying at the very edge of the brook, were the two little boys. And they were both alive. They were weak. They were barely alive, but they were alive.
And this is a dream?
This is a dream.
That's a very vivid dream.
It's a very vivid dream.
I don't typically remember them in that great of a detail, but when I do, sometimes if they seem like, wow, that was really vivid, I do write it down because I will forget later. But that happens very rarely.
Yeah.
Usually the only times that's happened is if I've been on a certain medication, like, I don't know, a sleeping pill or something. I don't take sleeping pills, but
yeah,
you know what I'm saying.
I do. Well, that's kind of what he chalked this up to. When he woke up the next morning, he didn't even really want to say anything. He figured, it's probably because we were talking about it
right
the day before.
That's what I would have thought.
Yeah. And he wasn't superstitious. So it wasn't like he placed some great confidence in this dream.
Right.
You know what I mean?
He wasn't trying to say, oh, I've had a vision of where they are.
No, not at all. In fact, he didn't say anything to anybody. But then the next night, he dreamed the exact same dream.
Okay.
He was out on that mountain alone looking for the boys, came to the dead deer, the worn out shoe, the stream, that narrow bridge, followed the brook, the birch tree with those roots. But this time, the little boy was dead.
One of them?
One of them was dead, and one of them were alive. This time he did wake up because it was like shocking to him that he had had this same very vivid dream twice. And he told his wife about the dream. She was from that place. She said, look, I know an area that would fit that description that you just gave me to a T. But he was hesitant to tell his neighbors about it. He was like, they're going to think I'm crazy or superstitious. And there's just no way there's anything to this.
Yeah. And he might even be thinking, and if I take them all down there and I'm wrong, they're going to tar and feather me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Even though his wife really wanted him to say something, he was not comfortable saying anything. But then he had the exact same dream.
A third time?
A third time.
Okay. It's time to wake up and pay attention to that.
Yes. Dead deer, crossed that creek, the ravine, then saw the tree. This time, both boys were dead.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Well, what I'm thinking is that the first night he had the dream, they might have both been still alive. And the second night, one of them had already passed away. And by the third night, it seems like he and his wife would have gone and looked.
Well, and the parents had really already given up hope. Everybody had. They were looking for bodies at that point, but they wanted their boys home.
Right.
They wanted to bury their babies.
Well, and you would at least want to know what had happened.
Yes.
Exactly. Okay, and one other thought. If he takes them there based on this dream that he's had now 3 times, and he's right, they might think he did it.
Right. So there's
he knew where
there's
they were.
A lot there's a lot to consider in all this. But when he told his wife about it, she said, go to my brother's. His name was Harrison Wysong. He lived 12 miles away, just right in the vicinity where she believed that dream seemed to be the place where, she thought it was. So at first he was like, I don't know, but he ended up going. And Wysong was understandably skeptical, but he listened to his brother-in-law. He knew his brother-in-law. He was a young guy. His sister was young and he was young. I think Jacob was maybe 30. Yeah. Like he was young. But as he listened, he started to pick the dream apart, and he remembered a place like that, just like the one he was describing, about 5 or 6 miles from the Cox home. But he thought it was kind of ridiculous to think that the kids could travel that far, especially because of that swollen creek. They just did not think there was any way. So he was reluctant, but he decided to go with Jacob to that place. On the morning of May 8th, 1856, 14 days after the children had been lost, Mr. Dibert and Mr. Wysong started out to find the boys. And eventually, they came to the dead deer, lying in their path, and a little further on, the worn-out shoe. Eventually, they came to the creek with the fallen tree that made the bridge, and that ended up being Bob's Creek over Blue Ridge. So they went to this little ravine, and gradually they could see in the distance, and they did come to that birch tree, and the little boys' thin little bodies were laying dead at the root of it.
Oh.
They were found at about 11 o'clock in the morning. When their daddy Samuel got there, he just bent over them and cried and cried and cried. Now suspicion switched from anything else to Jacob Dibert. And it's understandable.
Well, yeah.
It really, it is. He's telling everybody, I had a dream of where, But when the physicians examined their remains, the boys died from starvation. Just 2 to 4 days before they were found.
Oh, so it really may have, he really may have dreamed it that first night while they were still alive.
Felt terrible.
Right. Oh, goodness.
But, you can understand his hesitation.
Sure.
But he felt awful because if he would have just gone that first night, he would have saved their lives.
Oh.
On that part of the mountain where they were found, there wasn't anything to eat. Not even mountain tea, which I have no idea what that is, but it was in the newspaper.
Mountain tea?
Mountain tea. I'll have to look it up.
I was thinking something made from some leaves of a plant.
Probably, yeah. So Both of their bodies had been wasted really to almost skeletons. I mean, they had really starved.
Oh, that is so, so sad.
Their clothes were hung in shreds. Their shoes were almost worn through, even though they had just been sold.
Yeah.
Their bodies were scarred. Well, you got to think about it. They're trucking through these thick woods. The saddest part to me is that Joseph, the younger brother, had died first. And George had taken a rock, probably from the little brook, and he put it under his brother's head for a pillow.
Oh, that just breaks my heart.
The Bedford Inquirer on Friday, May 9th, the press to announce that the children were found yesterday, both dead. We have a letter from Mr. Griffith informing us of the fact. As soon as possible, they took a sled, and the boys' remains were taken to their parents' house about 6 miles away, and they were kept there until that following Sunday, when they were buried in Mount Union Cemetery. Their funeral was the largest that had ever been in that part of the state. There was about 5,000 people from Bedford County, some from Johnstown, and others as far away as Pittsburgh. Remains of both of the boys were put in one coffin. It makes me want to cry.
I know, it's so tragic.
They had a little modest tombstone purchased with the reward that had been given to Jacob Dibert and Mr. Wysong, who had found them. They donated the money for their tombstone. Their little stone read, George S., born March 30th, 1849, and Joseph C., born October 29th, 1850, sons of Samuel and Susanna Cox, wandered from home April 24th, 1856, and were found dead in the woods May 8th, the same year by Jacob Dibert and Harrison Wysong. Jacob Dibert would enlist in the Civil War. That happened shortly after, September 8th of 1861, and re-enlisted on the last day of December 1863. He was actually appointed corporal. He died at Point of Rocks, Virginia on October 26th, 1864, and was buried there in a mass grave. His cause of death was chronic diarrhea. He had been in a dozen or more hard battles while he was in the military, but, that dysentery ended up taking him out.
Yeah.
Susanna Cox would live to be 71 years old. She wrote a book called Babes in the Woods.
Oh.
She died in 1899 in Bedford County, Pennsylvania. When the boys died, she had 2 daughters. Remember, I told you she had Sarah Marie and Anna Josephine, and she was 6 months pregnant with Lydia Margaret. She and Samuel would go on to have 6 more children.
Wait, 6 more?
6 more children.
Wow.
She was having babies until she was in her 50s.
Wow.
Yes. Besides the 3 girls, so they had the 3 girls plus 6 more. So they had 9 children.
But he
would have had 11.
Yeah.
All of their children were born in the same cabin that George and Joseph wandered away from.
Oh, wow.
Samuel Cox would go on to serve in the Civil War. He enlisted September of 1863 and was discharged in June of 1865. He lived to be 84 years old and passed away in 1896.
Wow.
So, Allison Krauss has a song about this.
Wow. I've never heard it.
The most haunting, saddest, I seriously, that song, even Curtis, when we heard it, it would make us cry because it just reminded us so much of
your
just our
boys.
little boys and how they were. But you've got to listen to it. It's called Jacob's Dream.
Okay.
And Allison Krauss sings it. Actually, the girl who wrote the song, she was, Jacob Dibert was a descendant of hers.
Oh, how about that?
Yeah, so it was really neat. But anyway, I just want to ask the question. So what do you think? Do you think that Jacob Dibert had anything to do with it? Do you think it is a far-fetched idea. Or do you think, he really did dream that? What are your thoughts?
I don't typically put a lot of credibility in dreams and that kind of thing, but I do think there are times when people do have dreams that are And I think when you have the same one more than once,
Right.
there is a spiritual realm. I'm Baptist. I am not charismatic at all.
Right.
So again, I don't really follow a lot of that kind of thinking, but at the same time, I don't say that it couldn't happen.
Sure.
In this particular case, I don't believe he had anything to do with it. I believe he really did have that dream.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I do too, because I read an account from his wife. She wrote about it after he died, and she just, she kind of recounted the whole thing and their conversations, and it was a very well written little piece that she wrote. And so, yeah, I believe too that he had that dream.
And we do know that in the Old Testament, men had dreams that had meanings, and God showed them visions of stuff. So it's not, yeah.
Yeah. The crazy thing is that apparently one of his descendants also had a dream about somebody else in those same woods who had been lost. I think it was like his grandson who dreamed the dream. Yeah, it was.
And they found him?
And they found the person. It was a woman who was missing.
Oh, wow.
So that's crazy.
Yeah, that is crazy.
Yeah.
And just thinking about all that those parents went through, and then that man had to go to war.
Oh,
And those were some hard times.
They sure were.
Now, when my boys were about 3 and 5, my wife thought it would be a good idea to have me listen to the song that somebody wrote about these poor little fellers wandering off into the woods. And after that, I didn't think I would ever let them go outside by theirself again. But then my wife's brother thought it would be funny to convince them boys that the Mothman was real. And that did keep them from ever wandering into the woods by theirself till they were about 15. Make sure you tell everybody you know, and a few people you don't, to check us out. Till next time, goodbye.